The personality structure develops. If we look at the structure that we will have as a grown-up, the only part of that that's in existence at birth is the child within the child, or C1. And if we look inside of that, there's an even earlier structure, which Byrne called P1, A1, and C, or P0, A0, C0. And these are the ego states that we are born with that actually begin to develop in utero. They are innate plus what we develop in utero. There's a great book by Thomas Verney called The Secret Life of the Unborn Child that talks a lot about personality development in utero. By about the 6th month of conception, research has established that the child is aware of how mother and father feel about them, and a number of other things. They learn language, they learn to recognize music, and all kinds of things in utero. So these are P0, A0, and C0 are all part of C1, and are operating between conception and birth. Now, obviously, these are theoretical constructs. There's no literal circles in our head. But there is functioning that is analogous to these ego states. These are pretty much innate functions. P0 is like an innate instinctual problem-solving programs that we have to protect ourselves and take care of ourselves. A lot of the reflexes, like the grasping reflex, is part of that. If you hold an infant on its back and you just lower your hands a few inches rapidly, the infant will pull back the head to protect the base of the brain. The sucking reflex, there are just a lot of different innate instinctual programming that the infant has to help them survive. A0 is like an instinctual problem-solving mechanism. For example, the sucking reflex helps the child take in nourishment, but oftentimes the child has to root to find the nipple, and that's, I think, part of A0. Or if the child is hungry and lets the world know by crying, and nobody comes, the child will cry to get a response. If nobody comes, the child may stop crying to preserve their energy, conserve their energy. Or if somebody comes and slaps the child and says, stop all that racket, the child may stop crying and wait passively. And if somebody eventually comes and feeds the child will learn to wait passively rather than cry to get fed in the interest of survival. So there's a lot of instinctual problem solving that infants will do like that. That seems to be a function of A0. And C0 would be just the basic raw feelings, impulses, and so forth. Probably the closest thing to what Freud described as the id. And that's the structure that the child will operate with in the first 6 months of life after birth. And a lot of the development of the child is around feeding interactions, and nurturing and holding and that sort of thing. There are about 5 functions that or needs that the infant has that are necessary for survival. If you think about the child in utero, all of these needs are met automatically by Mother Nature. For example, we have a need for support that is provided by mother's pelvic structure. There's a need for protection that's provided by the amniotic sac and fluid. There's a need for nurturance, which is provided by the umbilical cord. There is a need for a sense of place, which is provided for by the womb. There's a need for permission that's provided by the womb expanding as the child grows. And there's also a need for a kind of respect between mother's body and the child's body. It's more of on a biological level at that stage. Once the child is born, it becomes yes, did you have a...
I was fascinated by that, and I just didn't get it all. So the pelvic protection.
Support is provided by the pelvic structure. Protection by the amniotic sac and fluid. Nurturance by the umbilical cord. Having a sense of belonging, a sense of place is provided by the womb. Permission is provided by the womb expanding as the child grows. There's permission to grow. And a sense of respect between mother's body and the child's body. Once the child is born, all of those needs need to be provided by the parents. And they, unfortunately, as human beings, we're not quite as good as Mother Nature sometimes. But sometimes Mother Nature also fails the child. When those needs are not met in utero, what often occurs is spontaneous abortion. When the parents don't meet those needs, I think what often occurs is kind of psychological abortion, in which the child often doesn't move beyond not getting that basic need met. And sometimes, infants, like Spitz discovers, become sick or die from a lack of nurturance or recognition or stimulation.
In the womb.
And later, in the first 6 months. There have been a number of programs developed where infants were failing to thrive and brought into hospitals, and the nurses taught the parents how to provide sufficient stimulation stroking for the child, and the child very quickly gains weight and begins to thrive. And just from that simple activity of providing the child the stimulation that they need. So the infant is the primary part of the personality that is operating between birth and about 6 months. And our personality begins to be shaped by the interactions around feeding and holding and stimulation and so forth that the child receives at that time. There's a series of actually movies that were made by Sylvia Brody back in the 1950s, looking at interactions between mothers and infants around feeding at 6 months, a year, 18 months. And it's just amazing how you can see the child's personality beginning to be shaped by how the mother is interacting with the child. And they were looking at 3 primary factors. One was nurturance, another was efficiency, and a third was control. And all the mothers came into this study because they were concerned about being good mothers. But the difference is astounding in terms of their capacity to nurture and interact appropriately, provide appropriate stimulation for these kids. And you can just see the different personality adaptations that Ian Stewart and I talk about in the book on personality adaptations taking place before your very eyes, you know, as you watch these movies. I highly recommend to take a look at those if you get a chance. The author is Sylvia Brody, and I can't remember this. It was a research study that was done in which she filmed the results of that. And I don't remember the exact title, but if you look up Sylvia Brody, you could probably find those.
So, based on, like, you have to really know how, like, or have a little bit of an idea of how your parents were or how you were as a child in order to try to really understand what type of ego or what type of personality you can fit into. But what if you don't have any sort of recollection of any memory from your childhood?
Then, as Byrne pointed out, you can pretty much discover that from how people present themselves and interact in the present. I mean, it's amazing how clear that becomes. The second ego state to develop is A1, what Byrne called the little professor. And that's being developed in what's called the exploratory phase from 6 to 18 months. And that's when kids become toddlers, begin to crawl down off a mother's lap and begin to explore the world beyond mother. And Margaret Mala has written a lot about that in The Psychological Birth of the Human Infant. That if you haven't read, I would highly recommend. But it's important during that stage that parents make sure that the world around the child is a safe place to explore by moving breakable objects to higher shelves, by plugging in light sockets with plastic plugs and so forth. A lot of the child's curiosity and intelligence is developed during that time, and often that is thwarted by parents not allowing the child to explore, by putting them in a baby carrier and a playpen or something where they're not allowed to move around and explore the world. In the extreme, a lot of times kids only, if they're not allowed to move very much and explore, they have sort of a two-dimensional view of the world because they've never had the chance to crawl around objects and see objects from different dimensions and develop a kind of three-dimensional view. And they, you know, the more kids are allowed to explore and learn, often the higher their intelligence will be, the more curious and creative they will be in terms of dealing with the world. In the first 18 months, there's a tremendous amount of brain development. Neural pathways that are new neural pathways that are being laid down. Later, those get pruned as kids, you know, don't use certain behaviors as much, and they get trimmed down, pruned. But there's a tremendous amount of neural development that occurs in the first 18 months. So it's really important that parents allow that and support that in the child learning about the world. The next ego state that is developed is the big adult, A2, begins to be developed between 18 months and 3 as the child begins to use language and can use those symbols to represent different things. The child will begin to learn to think rationally or cognitively. And it's a time of separation individuation, where the child begins to say no, to assert their own will, to want to do things their own way rather than the way mother and father want them to do things. And sometimes parents misperceive that and think they're losing control of the child and move into an over-controlling behavior, when in reality the child is attempting to develop their own sense of autonomy, to separate, individuate, become their own person. And what's important is for parents to be consistent and focus on problem solving. For example, if you're at a shopping mall and it's time to go, and the child says, I don't want to go, and lays down on the floor and starts having a temper tantrum, all you have to do to solve the problem is pick the child up and take them kicking and screaming out of the mall. And then when you get outside, to get them interested in something else. And what they learn is there's some things you have to do even though you don't want to, but you don't have to like it. And you get to express your displeasure and your will about them. And you're still okay. And the parents will still take care of you. And thinking is developed as the child is required to try to figure out how to do what they want to do, and at the same time meet the expectations and concerns of their parent. That requires adult ego state activity to figure out how to do that. And over time, if the child is expected to think and is not over-controlled, the child learns to use their adult ego state, and then later gets modeling from parents about how to use it more and more efficiently. The next ego state that develops is P1, the parent and the child, which again I call the magical parent, that's developing between 3 and 6 years of age. And at that time, the child is pulling together all the things that they have experienced up to that point and attempting to make sense out of that. And they often do that initially on the basis of fantasy. They often identify with fairy tales in which the character in the story, what's happening to them kind of existentially fits with the child's own experience. And they begin to form conclusions about who they are, who other people are, what the world is all about, and what will eventually happen to a person like me. And that's the initial formation of the script. The other thing that's occurring during that time is what Freud talked about in terms of the whole Oedipal complex, Electra complex, in which the child is beginning to develop their own unique personality, their sexual identity, and they often fall in love with a parent of the opposite sex. And what's important is for the child to experience that they can't be more important to that parent than their spouse is. And unfortunately, sometimes if parents are not getting a lot of excuse me, a lot of their emotional needs met, from their spouse, they might turn to the child for a lot of those emotional needs. And that if the child begins to get the idea sorry, that they are more important to the parent than the other partner is, they feel like they've won out over the other parent. And so one parent becomes the suitor, the other parent becomes the rival. So it's very important, and they lose both parents as parents. It's very important during that time that the child experience that they can't be more important to the other parent than that parent is. In that case, then what happens is they begin to experience that even though they can't be more special to mother or father than the other parent is, there's still plenty enough to go around. And they tend to identify with a parent of the same sex and don't have that grandiose notion that they can have any man or woman that they want. You know, if they went out, their grandiosity is they can have any parent that they want, any person that they want, and often they tend to, you know, other people's spouses look more attractive to them than their own. And they tend to act that out in adulthood often. So it's really important that parents help the child experience that they can't come between the parents, and they can still get their needs met. And there's no rivalry. So by 6 years of age, the child ego state is fully developed. As I mentioned earlier, the adult won't be totally developed until about 12. The next ego state that develops is the parent, and that is the primary ego state that is being developed between 6 and about 12, along with adult further development. And as I mentioned earlier, the child makes this radical transition between around 6 and 7. These ages are approximate because different children will develop at slightly different times. But between 6 and 12, the child is gathering information into their parent about how things work and how you do things, and kids get all kinds of messages about their competency, and sometimes they get injunctions against being successful if the parent believes they can't do things right and won't let them do things and get strokes for that. So the child is incorporating parent information, and it's really important that their adult is also allowed to ask questions during that time, because then the parent information gets integrated in with the adult information. Sometimes parents are fairly rigid, and they tell the child to do X, and the child says Y, and the parent might say, if you don't, I'll knock your head off. So the child learns to obey out of fear, but once the parents are not around, they throw out that information because it doesn't make any sense to them. If the parent says do X and the child says Y, and the parents explain that, and the child gets to argue with them or hassle with them about that until they get the information they need, then when the parents are no longer around, the child will continue to follow the parent message because it makes sense to them. And intuitively, sometimes kids will persist until they get the information they need. I remember one girl who was asked out on a date. She was asked to go over to a friend's house, I think, when she was about 8, and she knew this friend was not a safe person. So she came in and asked her mother, can I go over to Susie's house? And the mother said, sure. 5 minutes later, she came back and she said, Mother, can I go over to Susie's house? And Mother was still on the phone. She said, yes, I told you you could. Leave me alone. 5 minutes later, she came back. She said, Mother, can I go over to Susie's house? And Mother said, no, it's not Mother. She went away content. Because intuitively, she knew it wasn't safe to go over to Susie's house. And she needed that information, that limit from her mother. So kids will often argue and hassle and raise questions and everything until they get the information they need in their parent, get adult information integrated so it makes sense. And then their parent becomes very functional. When kids first begin to develop their parent, it's a very rigid parent. It hasn't been contextualized yet. So they will often tell you everything you're doing wrong. You know, get your elbows off the table, you know you shouldn't chew with food in your mouth, stuff like that. All the things the parents have ever said to them. And the parents have to help the child begin to contextualize the information, to learn that when you're at home with your family and relaxing, sometimes it's okay to put your foot on the table, your elbows on the table, but you don't do that out in public when you're in a formal setting, things like that. So the child learns when it's okay to do certain things, when it's not, and develops more of a contextualized parent. Now, unfortunately, some people never get that information, and they continue to operate with a very rigid, fundamentalistic parent all their life, which is very unfortunate, because they're basically operating out of fear, that they have to operate in a rigid way in order to be safe. So again, we internalize mother and father's parent, adult, and child, and that of other authority figures. And by 12 years of age, we have a completely developed personality structure. Again, we'll have new experiences, we will get new information, we will learn new ways of doing things all our life, but the basic structure is there from 12 on. Okay, any questions about that? That's a very quick overview of a lot of information. And I invite you to read in detail. The more you know about child development, the more appropriately you will be able to work with people in terms of recognizing the particular stage that they're dealing with. And none of us come through childhood having mastered the developmental task of every stage. That's the bad news. The good news is we continue to work on that all our lives until we get it worked out. Yeah.
Your example of the child telling the parent, we don't put our foot on the table. We don't put our feet on the table. Which ego state is that coming in at? Is that coming in?
Well, it's usually
at age 6, or is it coming in at P1?
It's usually coming from their parent, and they are telling us the way they have learned it from us. Gotcha. So all the things that we have told our kids to do, they then, when they're initially developing their parent ego state, will tell you.
And is that coming out of P1, or is it?
You know, it's coming out of, for the most part, P2, the big parent.
Okay. Because they're developing theirs.
Yeah.
And that's happening at age 6.
Between 6 and 12.
Okay.
By about 8 to 10, the child has a fully developed parent ego state that they can begin using socially and actively with other people. They can, for example, babysit younger kids. They can get pets to mind. You know, if you watch a 6-year-old, they will tell a dog sit all day long, and the dog will not pay any attention to it. At about 8 to 10, they can say sit in a way the dog will sit down, because they then have the power in their parent to really command that. It's inappropriate for parents to leave kids to babysit younger siblings by themselves until they get about between 8 and 12, because they don't yet have the information they need to really make all the appropriate decisions that they may need to make. Yes?
It is very new information for it's a very new information for me that recognize that the magic parent, which is a part of the child, develops later than the initial A2.
Right.
I am.
Yeah, it actually begins earlier than P1.
And okay, so the child is not still formed when A2 starts. The N2. C2.
C2 is still developing, but the emphasis, you know, around 18 to 3 years, shifts more to the adult in terms of learning to separate, individuate, to learn how to think initially. But the child doesn't really rely on that until about 6. They're still operating more on the basis of feeling and intuition and fantasy until about 6 to 7.
And if people could just raise their hand up high so I can see you, then I'll bring the mic, and you have to put the mic very close to your mouth in order for it to work. Thank you.
There's a really helpful series that was written by the Grisel Institute by Louise Bates Ames. And she has a book on every year of development, like your 1-year-old child, your 2-year-old child, 3-year-old child, and so forth. That is really helpful in terms of understanding what is going on developmentally at each age. Another resource I would highly recommend is Pamela Vann Landier's book, Cycles of Power, in which she talks about the psychological development at each of these stages. And we tend to recycle these stages at about every 7 years. We are reworking these different development stages. Yes.
The way this is presented as a structure, I'm sorry, the way this is presented as a structure, it looks like all the circles are kind of equally valued. Would you say that's right? Because what I'm getting is that the P1 seems to be the development of the initial script. Would that be possibly more important to behavior than some of the other ones, or are they really equally valued?
They all have important functions. All these ego states are necessary and important for the child to function, or the grown-up to function in appropriate ways. And it's not just P1 that's active in the development of the script. It's also C1 and A1 have a role in that. But once it's decided, it gets stored in P1. A1 is primarily the one that's picking up the injunctions and intuiting the meaning of those. But once the A1 makes a decision about what it means, then that information gets stored in P1 for future reference.
Can you repeat the 2 books?
Pamela Vann Landier, Cycles of Power, and the Grisel Institute series on child development by Louise Bates Ames. I would highly recommend taking a look at both of those, as well as later work by Daniel Stern and other developmental theorists. So again, by 12, this whole structure is fully developed. Now, a lot of people, when they hear about parent, adult, child, think, well, isn't this super ego, ego, and id in simply different language? And the answer is no. Super ego, ego, and id are all hypothetical intrapsychic constructs that act as influences on the ego states, but they are different. In the ego states are all observable social reality. We can all see a parent, an adult, or a child ego state operating on a social level. Nobody has ever seen a super ego, ego, or id. They've seen the results of it. But those are intrapsychic constructs, theoretical constructs. And I've drawn a little diagram that hopefully will help. Freud talked about the superego being primarily from society and kind of a repressive force on the child in developing. And the id he described as a kind of seething cauldron of unorganized will or activity. And the in contrast to that, if you think about the parent ego state, the parent is not only repressive but also very nurturing and affirmative. The id is this unorganized cauldron of seething emotion and unorganized will, whereas all children have a child ego state is a very organized system of feelings and thoughts. Children can say no with a great deal of willpower. So I think these are, if you look at Freud said the ego results from the interplay of these two interpsychic forces. And Federn talked about how there are archaic states of personality in the ego. And Vann then classified these in terms of parent, adult, and child. So all three of these are parts of the ego. They're all observable on the social level. And they are very organized and highly functional. We need all three in a balanced way to help us operate best in the world.
That means that the transactional analysis, after transactional analysis, the concept is that even if I recognize I have a parent state and a child state, I still have a superego and an ID.
Right. What could be described as that? Yes. That are operating interpsychically. I mean, in Freudian theory, those are interpsychic constructs or forces that act as determinants. And in terms of the ego states, the parent is most heavily influenced by the superego, but it also contains elements of ego and id function. The child is most heavily influenced by the id, but it also contains elements of superego and ego function. Probably the P1 is the closest thing to what Freud described as the superego, interestingly enough, the parent and the child. Adult is pretty much pure ego function.
Another error that people sometimes make when they first hear about ego states is they assume that the adult is the only appropriate ego state. If we were always in our adult, we'd look a little like Mr. Spock on Star Trek. Or, kind of a walking computer without any strong feelings or values or whatever. We need all three ego states to operate in a balanced way. The child is really the most fun, enjoyable part of the personality. It's the part that's capable of forming warm, loving relationships with other people. It's the part of us that gives us our unique character. We need an adult to be able to process information and mediate between our child desires and the concerns of our parents, our values and ethics. We also need a parent ego state in terms of both knowing how to nurture and caretake ourselves and our children and other people. And we need appropriate limits on our own behavior so we don't act in ways that hurt others or allow others to hurt us. So we need all three to function in a healthy way. There's some people in TA who believe that once you're healthy, you have everything integrated into the adult. I have a different view. I believe that we integrate our adult information with the parent and child information, but we continue to retain all three ego states. In other words, the overall ego is integrated in terms of the functioning of those states, but we still retain a parent, adult, and child. Everything is not drawn into the adult ego state. And that may be simply semantically different ways of talking about the same phenomena. But I think it's really important to recognize that we need all three ego states for healthy functioning. And I think we continue to have new experiences in which we internalize new information in our parent. We learn how to operate with our adult even better. And we have new learnings in our child ego state. what makes the first 6 years so powerful is because we're experiencing, as Tom Harris said, every basic human emotion, probably in the most intense form we'll ever experience it throughout our whole life. And we're making conclusions, decisions about that. Later on, we have adult information to help us make sense out of experiences that we didn't have in the first 6 years. Also want to say a word about our sense of self, as Vern talked about it. He talked about us having a movable sense of self. And he talked about our sense of real self will be wherever our spontaneous energy is greatest. So as I'm talking with you, if I'm really having fun and enjoying what I'm doing, my sense of real self is going to be more in my child ego state. I'm using my adult to communicate, but my sense of self is going to be more in a kind of spontaneous, free child place. If you ask me a very difficult question and I have to stop and think very hard about it and so forth, then I'm going to have, my sense of self is going to move more to adult. If somebody does something in the room that's hurtful of somebody else, I may move to parent and say it's not okay to do that. So, and my sense of self is going to be slightly different. But that sense of self will move around from ego state to ego state, depending on wherever our spontaneous energy is greatest. And that may be different from the ego state that is really in charge of what we're doing. Vern called that the executive. And he talked about the executive being the ego state where our active energy is greatest. Now, active energy is made up of both spontaneous energy and what he called unbound energy. That's potential energy, that is energy that's active in terms of doing a task. And he used the example of a monkey sitting in a tree. As long as the monkey is just sitting there not moving, the monkey has what's called bound energy. It's similar to high school physics when you have a rock sitting up on top of the hill and it's not moving, but it has potential energy. Bound and potential basically are analogous. If the rock starts rolling down the hill, it has active energy. It has energy that can be used to do work. Or if the monkey falls out of a tree, you know, if a rope were tied to his leg and a coconut was on the other end of the rope, it pulled the coconut up in the tree. You know, it would do work. Spontaneous energy is energy that is willfully directed. For example, if the monkey jumps to another limb, that's spontaneous energy. So Vern talked about all three types of energy. And the importance of that is like the attorney who's up in front of the courtroom defending his case. His adult is in executive. Most of his active energy is in the adult, but his spontaneous energy, his real sense of self, is in his child. He's feeling like a frightened 8-year-old. If he moves enough energy into fear, he might excuse himself and walk out of the courtroom. And at that point, his real self and his executive are both in child. He's moved energy from adult to child. So that's a useful concept in terms of just differentiating why at certain points we may be doing something, but we feel like I wasn't really being me, or that wasn't my real self, or whatever. You hear people make statements like that. So we have a different sense when about ourselves when our one ego state is executive and another ego state is our sense of real self. Sometimes those are in the same ego state, sometimes they're in different ego states.
Would a sense of calmness be, you know, how would that factor into what you're describing? You know, when you're in these different states, moving energy around and stuff, when you reach a state of calmness, is that an how does that feed into the idea of real self?
Usually when people in a very relaxed state or in a meditative state, they behaviorally they're often in their child in a calm place. They may have adult activity going or parental activity going, but the child is the original part of us. So when we're sleeping, for example, we're in our child ego state. When we're in a very calm, relaxed, meditative place, we're often in our child ego state, with having some energy in other ego states as well. You can have energy in all three ego states at once. For example, if I'm walking downtown, going to a store to buy something, I may be thinking about what I'm going to buy when I get to that store, and I may be humming a tune I heard on the radio that morning. And I also am kind of on automatic pilot, not even having to think about, crossing the street in safety because, my parent is in charge and I'm doing that. Or you've experienced driving a car when you haven't been thinking about it, your parent is on automatic pilot. If suddenly I hear a horn blare, probably all my energy is going to suddenly go into child and I'm going to jump out of the way. And then I probably will go up in my parent and reprimand myself for not paying better attention, and so on. So my energy will move around according to the situation I'm in and what's appropriate.
And if the healthy situation is that how you feel is same as how you function or how you act, is it the healthy situation or?
If by how you feel you mean where your sense of self is, that would be true.
I mean, for example, if you feel that now you have to say something, and because of politeness, you don't let yourself to say that thing. If it is healthier to say that, or how is that?
It depends on the circumstances. I mean, sometimes our parent and child will be in conflict. Our child may spontaneously want to say something, but from our parent, we restrain ourselves because it may not be helpful at that moment or may cause difficulty or whatever. So that's why we need all three ego states functioning in a balanced way. But if we inhibit ourselves by telling ourselves other people will laugh and make fun of us if we say something, that would not be helpful.
So in that case, I may be having thoughts that I think are good thoughts, but I'm afraid to say them because I'm also thinking that someone else may not think they're worthwhile.
Right. May criticize me or whatever. Yeah.
And at that point, I'm only involved with bound energy.
Right. Yes. An example of bound energy is none of you are getting up and down, jumping up and down and screaming at this moment. But if you were rooting for your favorite athletic team, you'd probably be doing that. But right now, that energy is bound.
Yeah, regarding the problem, the children with ODD or disruptive behavior, so that's they pass their energy in negative way. So how can we relate this with that sense of self, that energy, children's energy?
I'm not really clear on everything you said.
Children with ODD or the disruptive behavior or any behavior problem, they did lot of things around the home, destructive things. So they pass their energy in negative way.
Yeah.
So how can we relate that energy with the sense of self of children, that children?
Well, I think it's important, again, to set appropriate limits and
Yeah.
teach children why it's okay to do things in certain contexts and not in others, or doing things that are productive rather than destructive. A lot of that is what they've learned in terms of how to get attention.
Yes, yes.
So if you're providing positive attention in an intense way, kids don't have to get into negative behavior. But frequently, if nobody is paying attention, they learn that negative attention works much better than positive. If you ask somebody for a hug, they may or may not give you one. If you kick them in the shins, you're almost guaranteed a response. And kids learn that very early. I used to go home from work, and my daughters would want me to play with them. And if I would stop and play with them for a few minutes, they were fine. If I didn't, they invariably would do something in the room to get my attention, and it was usually something they knew they shouldn't do, because they knew I would respond then. So I learned very quickly with them to either follow through and play with them a few minutes, or tell them that I wanted to read the newspaper for 10 minutes and then I would play, and if I followed through, they would be content for that long. So it's important to help our kids get the attention and recognition that they need, because a lot of, quote, bad behavior is developed around ways that kids learn to get our attention when we're not paying attention directly. Yes?
Talking about the sense of self, does that develop, or do you become aware of that in your adolescence or at an earlier age? Like, when does that develop?
Well, it's more of an intuitive sense, a felt sense. And usually that's developed in childhood, but sometimes we lose touch with that as we grow because we're not as much in touch with our feelings and intuition, especially if we've been taught not to be. So. Adults often have to learn how to get back in touch with their feelings and their bodies and sensations and so forth, because they've learned not to pay attention to those. Often the intellect is valued over all of that. So, any questions about the three types of energy? Bound, unbound, and free? Spontaneous? Okay. Let me talk a little bit about how Burns said to go about diagnosing an ego state. He said a complete diagnosis is made up of 4 different parts. The first is a behavioral diagnosis, and that's the one that most of us rely on most in diagnosing ego states. It's basically looking at the person's behavior, their movements, their tone of voice, their gestures, their mannerisms, posture, all of that, and do they look like a child? Is their behavior childlike, or is it more adult-like or parental? You know, what do you see when you observe the person operating? Secondly, second is what's called a social or operational diagnosis, and that's when we look at what one person's behavior, the effect that that has on somebody else. For example, if I'm in my adult ego state, I'm likely to elicit information, thinking, problem solving from you. If I'm in my natural child being playful, I'm likely to elicit a sense of fun and enjoyment from you. Or if you think that's inappropriate, I'm likely to elicit your parent ego state, who may reprimand me or whatever. If I'm in my parent ego state, talking about, isn't it terrible the way kids are acting these days and so forth, I'm likely to elicit your own critical parent who will join me in that. Or I might elicit, if you don't have the same values, I'm likely to elicit your child ego state who may rebel against that kind of critical parent attitude. So you can get some sense of what ego state a person is in by looking at what their behavior is eliciting in someone else. And that's called a social or operational diagnosis. The third is what is called a historical diagnosis. You can find out what the person was like as a child, if they were carefree and happy, angry and rebellious, whiny and sulky, and correlate that with what you see in the present in terms of their child ego state. And that is the further indication of which ego state they're in. Or you can find out what their parents were like and correlate that with what you see about their parent ego state in the present. And behavior that doesn't fit into either of those is likely to be adult. So you can gather historical information that helps you then diagnose the person's ego state as it's operating. And the fourth area is, or fourth method of diagnosis, is called a phenomenological or existential diagnosis. And that's just looking at how the person is experiencing the present moment. If you ask them a question and they start giving you value judgments of some sort, positive or negative, you know they're probably in their parent. If they're giving you factual information, like the light on the wall is approximately 1 foot by 3 feet, you know they're in their adult ego state because they're giving you data, factual information. If they start, if you ask them a question and they give you a lot of strong feeling response or an intuitive perception or whatever, you know they're likely to in their child ego state. So how a person is experiencing the current phenomena is a further indication of which ego state they're in. But again, the one we rely on most heavily is the first one, a behavioral diagnosis. There have been a number of articles in the TA Journal about research projects that have been done where people are given a list of behavioral descriptives for the different ego states, and they can observe, a group of people can observe another individual and pick out with a high degree of correlation the particular ego state that they're in. So all of this is observable social phenomena that we can become quite adept at recognizing. Any questions about that? Or any of the other things that I've talked about so far this morning?
Describing that in terms of ego states instead of problem solving. I'm understanding that problem solving is attributed to the adult ego state. But along with that, what you're saying, or another way to say it is, people jump into the parent, jump into the child, jump into the parent, jump into the child.
Sometimes jump into the adult.
Well,
you know, if you're in your child and you're playing and being spontaneous and suddenly you're faced with a difficult situation, you may need to affect adult really fast in order to help take care of yourself. So we can jump into any of those three.
All right.
Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up and go to lunch?